The man who made young black people say I am somebody, how Malcolm X changed everything. There was a time when being young and black in America meant walking through a world that told you every single day that you were less than. It whispered it in the back of classrooms where your history was erased. It shouted it from water fountains marked "colored only." It lived in the eyes of people who crossed the street when they saw you coming. But then came a voice that cut through all that noise like a lightning bolt on a summer night. A voice that didn't ask for permission or apologize for existing. A voice that looked America straight in the eye and said, "No more." That voice belonged to Malcolm X. And if you were a young black person in the 1960s and 70s, hearing him speak for the first time changed something deep inside you that could never be changed back. Do you remember the first time you heard Malcolm's voice? Maybe it was on a small transistor radio crackling with static in your grandmother's kitchen. Maybe it was at a community meeting in a church basement where folding chairs were packed so tight you could barely breathe. Maybe it was a recording someone played at your house, the adults gathering around with faces so serious you knew something important was happening. Wherever you were, whatever you were doing, when Malcolm X spoke, everything stopped. His words didn't sound like the speeches you heard in school or the sermons you heard on Sunday morning. They sounded like truth stripped down to its bones, raw and unfiltered and absolutely fearless. Malcolm didn't talk like other leaders. He didn't use the language of patience and waiting and someday. He used the language of now and today and right this minute. When he said, "by any means necessary," young black people across America felt something wake up inside them. When he said, "you can't drive a knife into a man's back 9 inches, pull it out 6 inches, and call it progress." They nodded their heads because they had been feeling that same frustration their whole lives but didn't have the words to say it. Malcolm gave them the words. He gave them the framework. He gave them permission to be angry about injustice and to demand better without apologizing for it. If you grew up in a black household in the 1960s, you knew there were basically 2 camps when it came to the civil rights movement. There were the folks who believed in Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence and peaceful protest, and there were the folks who felt Malcolm X was speaking the real truth about what it would take to get free. Dinner table conversations could get heated when Malcolm's name came up. Your parents might have disagreed about his methods, but nobody could deny the power of his presence or the way he made black people feel proud of who they were. Malcolm X understood something that a lot of young black people were just beginning to figure out in those years. He understood that before you could fight for equality in the streets, you had to win the battle in your own mind. He understood that the most dangerous weapon white supremacy had wasn't dogs or fire hoses or laws. It was the lie it planted in black people's heads that said they deserved to be treated as less than human. Malcolm made it his mission to rip that lie out by the roots and replace it with something powerful: self-love, self-knowledge, and self-determination. When Malcolm talked about black history, he didn't start with slavery like your textbooks did. He started in Africa, in kingdoms and empires where black people built pyramids and universities and civilizations that thrived for centuries. He talked about Mansa Musa and Timbuktu and the greatness that existed before the slave ships ever set sail. For young black students sitting in classrooms where their teachers told them their ancestors were primitive and uncivilized, hearing Malcolm talk about African glory was like oxygen after being underwater. It gave them something to hold on to, something to be proud of, a history that belonged to them. Do you remember how it felt to learn that your people had been kings and queens? That your ancestors weren't just victims, but builders and scholars and warriors. For so many young black people, Malcolm X was the first person who taught them that. He didn't wait for white institutions to tell the truth about black history. He went out and found it himself, studied it, and then shared it with anyone who would listen. He made young black people hungry to know more, to read more, to question everything they had been taught in schools that were designed to make them feel small. Malcolm's influence on young black people went way beyond politics and history. It showed up in how they wore their hair. In the mid-1960s, as Malcolm's message spread, more and more young black people started rejecting the straightening combs and relaxers that had been part of black beauty culture for decades. They started wearing their hair natural in afros that grew big and round and unapologetic. The afro became a symbol of black pride, a physical manifestation of Malcolm's message that black people didn't need to change themselves to be beautiful or acceptable. Your hair was political, your appearance was a statement, and Malcolm X had planted the seed for that transformation. It showed up in the names people chose for their children. Parents who had been given European names by ancestors who never had a choice started looking to Africa for inspiration. Names like Jamal and Kareem and Aisha started appearing more frequently in black communities, each one a small act of reclaiming identity. Malcolm himself had changed his name, rejecting Little as a slave name and taking X to represent the African name that had been stolen from his ancestors. That symbolic act resonated deeply with young people who were beginning to understand that names carried power and history. It showed up in the way young black people carried themselves. There was a shift that happened after Malcolm, a straightening of spines and a lifting of heads, a refusal to step off the sidewalk when white people approached, a willingness to look people in the eye and demand respect. Malcolm taught young black people that dignity wasn't something you begged for, it was something you claimed for yourself. He taught them that self-defense wasn't violence, it was common sense. He taught them that loving black people and black culture wasn't racism, it was revolutionary. The Black Panther Party, which would become one of the most influential organizations for young black activists in the late 1960s and early 1970s, drew heavily from Malcolm's philosophy. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the founders of the Panthers, were deeply influenced by Malcolm's teachings about self-defense, community control, and black self-determination. When young black people joined the Panthers and started breakfast programs for children, health clinics in underserved neighborhoods, and community patrols to protect against police brutality, they were carrying forward the vision Malcolm had articulated before his death. Did you know anyone who joined the Panthers back then? Maybe it was an older cousin or a kid from the neighborhood who came back from college talking about revolution. Maybe you saw them in their black berets and leather jackets, standing tall and fearless in a way that made your heart beat faster. Whether you agreed with everything they did or not, you couldn't deny that they believed in something bigger than themselves. And that belief, that willingness to put everything on the line for the freedom of black people, came directly from the example Malcolm X had set. For young black women, Malcolm's influence was complicated but profound. He wasn't perfect when it came to gender politics. His views on women's roles were sometimes traditional and limited. But he also raised strong daughters and spoke about the importance of protecting and uplifting black women. More importantly, the philosophy of self-determination and self-love that he preached gave young black women permission to reject beauty standards that had never been meant for them anyway. It gave them language to talk about the unique oppression they faced as black women in America. It gave them confidence to step into leadership roles in the movements that were shaping the future. Young black women in the 1960s were navigating a complicated world. They faced racism from white society and sometimes sexism within their own communities. But Malcolm's message of self-worth and refusing to accept degradation applied to them too. They heard him talk about the importance of black women in building strong families and communities. They heard him evolve in his thinking, especially after his trip to Mecca, when he began to see the struggle in more universal terms. These young women took what was useful from Malcolm's teachings and combined it with their own experiences to forge a path forward that honored both their blackness and their womanhood. Malcolm's assassination in 1965 devastated young black people across the country. The news spread through black neighborhoods like wildfire, and the grief was immediate and crushing. For many, it felt like losing a father or a brother, someone who had been speaking directly to them, seeing them, understanding them in ways no one else did. The churches and community centers where he had spoken were filled with mourners, young people especially, crying openly for a man who had made them believe they could be something more than what America told them they were. But here's what those young people learned in the days and weeks and years after Malcolm's death. You can kill a man, but you can't kill an idea whose time has come. Malcolm's words lived on in the speeches people gave at rallies and protests. His books, especially the autobiography of Malcolm X, became essential reading for anyone serious about understanding black liberation. His image showed up on posters and t-shirts and murals painted on the sides of buildings in black neighborhoods from Harlem to Oakland. He became a martyr, yes, but more than that, he became a permanent part of black consciousness. The autobiography, written with Alex Haley, became something of a sacred text for young black people trying to understand their place in the world. They read about Malcolm's transformation from street hustler to minister to revolutionary leader and saw in his story proof that people could change, grow, and become something greater than their circumstances. They read about his pilgrimage to Mecca and his expanding worldview in the final year of his life. They studied his words like scripture, underlining passages, memorizing speeches, debating what he meant, and what he would have wanted them to do. Students at historically black colleges and universities studied Malcolm's speeches and writings alongside the works of Frantz Fanon and W.E.B. Du Bois. They debated his ideas in dormitories late into the night, arguing about whether armed self-defense was necessary, whether integration was the goal or a distraction, whether America could ever truly change. These weren't abstract intellectual exercises. These were questions about how to survive, how to resist, how to build a future where black children wouldn't have to grow up under the same oppression their parents had endured. In those late-night dorm room sessions, with incense burning and Miles Davis or John Coltrane playing softly in the background, young black students wrestled with Malcolm's legacy. They asked themselves, what does it mean to be black in America? What do we owe our ancestors? What do we owe the generation coming after us? How do we honor Malcolm's memory while also charting our own path? These conversations shaped a generation of black leaders, activists, artists, and thinkers who would go on to transform American society in ways both large and small. In the 1970s, as disco and funk dominated the radio and a new generation of black kids came of age, Malcolm's influence was still everywhere. The Black Power movement that he had helped inspire was still shaping culture and politics. Young people wore dashikis and celebrated Kwanzaa and learned Swahili in community classes. They read Message to the Grassroots and The Ballot or the Bullet, and understood that the struggle Malcolm had dedicated his life to was far from over. They saw themselves as inheritors of his legacy, responsible for carrying the torch forward. Think about how different the world would have been if Malcolm X had never spoken up. if he had stayed silent, if he had accepted the lies that America told about black people, if he had never found the courage to challenge both white supremacy and the sometimes too cautious approach of mainstream civil rights leaders. How many young black people would have continued to internalize the hatred directed at them? How many would have straightened their hair and changed their names and tried to make themselves smaller just to survive? Malcolm refused to do that, and in refusing, he gave permission to millions of others to refuse as well. His influence crossed generational lines in ways that are still visible today. The grandparents who heard Malcolm speak in person told their children about him. Those children told their children. And now, decades after his death, young black people are still discovering Malcolm X, still finding in his words the same fire and truth that lit up their grandparents' generation. His autobiography is still assigned in schools, still passed from hand to hand, still changing lives. Malcolm taught young black people to read critically, to question everything, to never accept the version of history that painted them as inferior or irrelevant. He taught them that education was a weapon, that knowledge was power, that understanding where you came from was essential to knowing where you were going. He turned classrooms and living rooms and street corners into spaces of radical learning where the curriculum was truth and the goal was liberation. The impact of Malcolm X on black youth culture can't be measured just in political movements or organizational memberships. It lives in the music that came after him, the hip-hop artists who would sample his speeches decades later and introduce his words to new generations. It lives in the films and books and art that black creators made, infused with the pride and defiance and determination that Malcolm embodied. It lives in every young black person who ever looked in the mirror and said, "I am beautiful, I am worthy, I am enough." Because those simple truths are revolutionary in a world designed to make black people hate themselves. When you think back to those years, to the 1960s and 70s when Malcolm's voice was still echoing through black America, what do you remember feeling? Was it pride? Was it anger? Was it hope? Was it all three at once, tangled together so tightly you couldn't separate them? For young black people living through that era, Malcolm X didn't just give speeches. He gave them a new way of seeing themselves and the world around them. He gave them permission to be angry about injustice and to channel that anger into action. He gave them pride in their blackness at a time when everything in American society told them they should be ashamed. Malcolm X made young black people understand that freedom wasn't something white people were going to hand over out of the goodness of their hearts. It was something black people would have to take for themselves, organize for themselves, fight for themselves. He taught them that waiting for justice was a fool's game, that real change came from building power and using it strategically. He taught them to be suspicious of anyone who told them to be patient while their people were dying. And perhaps most importantly, Malcolm X taught young black people that they didn't need white approval or white validation to know their own worth. They didn't need to be accepted into white institutions to be successful or valuable or fully human. They could build their own institutions, create their own standards of excellence, define success on their own terms. This was revolutionary thinking in an era when integration was seen as the ultimate goal by many civil rights leaders. Malcolm asked uncomfortable questions. Integration into what? Equality with whom? Freedom on whose terms? The young people who heard those questions and took them seriously went on to create some of the most important black institutions of the late 20th century. They founded Black Studies programs at universities, Black-owned businesses, Black cultural centers, Black independent schools where their children could learn a curriculum that honored their history and culture. They understood, because Malcolm had taught them, that real power came from building strong communities that could sustain themselves. In cities across America, young Black people inspired by Malcolm's vision started community organizations that addressed the real needs of their neighborhoods. They opened bookstores that sold books by and about Black people, books you couldn't find in mainstream stores. They started newspapers and magazines that told the truth about what was happening in Black communities. They created art collectives and theater groups that produced work reflecting Black experiences and perspectives. They built food cooperatives and credit unions that kept money circulating within Black neighborhoods. These weren't just business ventures or cultural projects. They were acts of resistance and self-determination. Every Black-owned bookstore was a declaration that Black stories mattered. Every community newspaper was a rejection of white media's distorted coverage of Black life. Every cooperative was a statement that Black people could take care of themselves and each other. And all of it traced back to the seeds Malcolm had planted in the minds of young people who heard him speak. Looking back now, how do you think Malcolm X changed you? If you were young when he was speaking, did his words plant seeds that grew into who you became? Did you name your children African names because of him? Did you wear your hair natural because of him? Did you go to college and study Black history because of him? Did you join organizations fighting for justice because of him? Or maybe you disagreed with him, maybe you thought he was too radical, too angry, too unwilling to compromise. But even in disagreeing, didn't you think about the questions he raised? Didn't you have to reckon with the truth in his critiques? Even those who never fully embraced Malcolm's philosophy had to acknowledge the power of his presence and the validity of many of his critiques. He forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about racism and oppression. He forced the civil rights movement to grapple with questions about the pace of change and the limits of nonviolence. He forced Black people to think deeply about what freedom really meant and whether integration into a racist society was the same thing as liberation. For young Black people in particular, Malcolm represented something that the mainstream civil rights movement sometimes didn't: raw, uncompromising truth-telling. He didn't soften his message to make white people comfortable. He didn't worry about being called divisive or aggressive or angry. He said what needed to be said, and young people responded to that authenticity. In a world full of people telling them to be patient and wait their turn, Malcolm told them they had every right to be impatient and demand what was rightfully theirs. The way Malcolm spoke about white people was shocking to some, but for many young Black people, it was refreshing. He didn't pretend that most white people were allies or that racism was just a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with dialogue. He named white supremacy as a system, not just individual prejudice. He talked about how even well-meaning white people benefited from that system and often protected it, consciously or not. These observations made many people uncomfortable, but they rang true for young Black people who had experienced racism firsthand and were tired of having their experiences dismissed or minimized. Malcolm also taught young Black people about internationalism, connecting the struggle of Black Americans to liberation movements around the world. He traveled to Africa and the Middle East, meeting with leaders of newly independent nations and seeing himself as part of a global majority rather than a domestic minority. He helped young Black people understand that they weren't alone in their struggle, that people of color around the world were fighting against colonialism, imperialism, and white supremacy. This global perspective was empowering. expanding the fight for justice beyond the borders of the United States. When Malcolm returned from his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964, some of his thinking had evolved. He had seen Muslims of all races worshiping together as equals, and it challenged some of his earlier beliefs about the impossibility of racial unity. But even as his philosophy became more nuanced and inclusive in his final year, he never backed away from his core message about Black self-determination and the need for radical change. Young people who followed his evolution saw that growth and change were possible without abandoning principles or selling out. The final year of Malcolm's life, when he had broken from the Nation of Islam and was developing his own organization of Afro-American Unity, showed young people what independent Black leadership could look like. He was building something new, connecting with activists across the spectrum, developing a more sophisticated political analysis, and still speaking truth to power at every opportunity. His assassination cut that work short, but the example remained. Black people could build their own organizations, develop their own strategies, and fight for liberation on their own terms. In the years after Malcolm's death, as the civil rights movement evolved and sometimes fractured, as Black power became both a rallying cry and a source of controversy, his words continued to provide guidance and inspiration. When young Black activists debated strategy and tactics, they often invoked Malcolm. When artists created work celebrating Black culture and challenging oppression, Malcolm's influence was evident. When students demanded Black studies programs at universities, they were following the path Malcolm had laid out. The FBI had monitored Malcolm closely, viewing him as a threat to the social order. After his death, documents revealed the extent of government surveillance and harassment he had endured. For young Black people learning about this later, it confirmed what Malcolm had always said. The system saw conscious, organized Black people as dangerous. It validated the importance of the work Malcolm had done and the need to continue it. If the government had been that afraid of Malcolm's message, it must have been powerful indeed. What's remarkable is how Malcolm's message continued to resonate across different eras and contexts. In the 1980s, when crack cocaine devastated Black communities and Reagan-era policies attacked the social safety net, young people turned to Malcolm's words about self-reliance and community building. In the 1990s, when hip-hop became the voice of a new generation, rappers sampled Malcolm's speeches and echoed his defiant stance. In the 2000s and beyond, as new movements for Black lives emerged, organizers looked to Malcolm's example of uncompromising advocacy and grassroots organizing. For young Black people growing up in the 1960s and 70s, Malcolm X was more than a political leader or religious figure. He was a cultural icon, a symbol of Black pride and resistance. His image appeared on medallions that kids wore around their necks, on posters that hung in bedrooms and community centers, on buttons pinned to jackets and bags. Wearing Malcolm's image was a statement about who you were and what you stood for. It said you weren't ashamed of being Black, that you understood the struggle, that you were ready to fight for justice. The barber shops and beauty salons in Black neighborhoods became sites of political education where people debated Malcolm's ideas. Older men who had heard him speak would share their memories with younger folks, passing down the oral tradition of Malcolm's power as a speaker. These conversations kept his legacy alive in a direct, personal way that complemented the books and recordings. They made Malcolm feel real and accessible, not just a historical figure, but someone who had walked these same streets and understood these same struggles. Malcolm X's influence on young Black people in the 1960s and 70s was profound, transformative, and lasting. He gave them language for their pain and their pride. He gave them heroes from African history to claim as their own. He gave them permission to be angry and to demand better. He gave them a vision of Black power and Black self-determination that shaped movements for decades to come. He gave them the courage to look in the mirror and see beauty, strength, intelligence, and infinite possibility. And when he was taken away, murdered at the age of 39 with so much work still to do, the young people who loved him didn't let his legacy die. They carried it forward. They taught it to their children. They lived by the principles he had articulated. They kept his words alive. They proved that you can assassinate a revolutionary, but you cannot kill a revolution whose time has come. The young people Malcolm inspired went on to become teachers and activists, artists and organizers, parents and grandparents who passed down his teachings to the next generation. They became the elders in their communities, the ones young people came to for wisdom and guidance. And when they spoke, you could hear echoes of Malcolm in their words, in their insistence on truth and justice, in their refusal to accept less than full humanity and freedom. Today, when we see young Black people demanding justice, organizing in their communities, celebrating their culture, and refusing to accept oppression, we're seeing the fruit of seeds Malcolm planted decades ago. His influence lives on in every natural hairstyle worn with pride, every African name chosen with intention, every community organization built to serve Black people, every demand for self-determination and dignity. Malcolm's legacy isn't just in history books. It's alive and active in the ongoing struggle for Black liberation. Which Malcolm X speech or quote hit you hardest when you first heard it? How did Malcolm's message change the way you saw yourself as a young Black person? What do you wish young people today understood about Malcolm X's true impact?